Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is Journal of the American Revolution contributor Doug Dorney, and he'll be discussing the Battle of Barbados, a naval battle that most revolutionary historians aren't very familiar with. It's one of the reasons we're very lucky to have his article published here at the Journal of the American Revolution. Doug, welcome back.
Thank you.
Doug, you've been on the show before. Remind us about your background.
Yeah, I'm an architect by trade. That's what I do as my day job, and my hobby on weekends and evenings is researching the revolution and writing about it. I wouldn't call myself a historian, but some of these topics really catch me, and I feel like I have to research them and write about them. So I've been doing that since about 2019. So I've been reading about the revolution for about 25 years now. Lots of gray hair since then, gray beard even. But I've been writing for the journal, I believe, since 2019. So I've done, I think, 9 articles now. There's lots more in the pipeline. And one of the things I've spoken to you about a little bit last time we spoke was a book. So one of the most, I would say the most I've written about has been Revolutionary War soldier demographics. So I've got a number of articles on that topic. And publisher reached out to me a few years ago and submitted a manuscript. And the book should be out hopefully next year before the anniversary of July 4th next year. So it's tentatively titled Revolutionary War Soldiers of the Southern States: A Demographic View. So it's a study of 8,500 pension applicants and their demographic details. So it's probably, hopefully, as far as I understand it, it will be the biggest study ever completed of Revolutionary War soldier personal details. Things like where they were born, how long they served, and where they lived after the war. Lots of other details, but that's it in a nutshell.
Wonderful.
Long
So,
introduction. I apologize.
no, that's exactly what we're here for. So, Doug, tell us about this particular topic.
Yep.
A naval battle in the Caribbean
Yep.
maybe doesn't necessarily fit into what you just described to us, but it's very important. So, tell us about it.
Yeah, and I think I would say that one of the things I've realized quite a bit is that the naval battles, the naval warfare hasn't been a topic of much discussion among the historiography of the Revolutionary War. That even at the Journal, I think it has is they're breaking new ground, and they're covering lots of uncovered territory. It doesn't spend a lot of time on the naval aspects of the revolution. And this story, I think, was one of the reasons why I approached it. And number two was I didn't know a lot about it, so it was an opportunity for me to learn about the naval side of the revolution. But the story comes from, where my interest in it comes from. I mentioned this a few seconds ago, but pension applications. So 2 years ago, I was writing an article on South Carolina pension applicants, which is published in the journal, I think in 2023 or 2024. But as I was researching those South Carolina pension applicants, there were 3 pensions which popped up almost in very quick succession. It's almost like they were, I don't know, maybe it's the algorithms or something along those lines, but 3 pensions popped up of South Carolina Continental soldiers who served as Marines on South Carolina State Navy vessels. So, it was maybe, I don't know if it was karma or something like that, but 3 of these men had witnessed the battle off Barbados. They were serving as Marines on State Navy ships, and also the frigate Randolph. Obviously, they wouldn't have submitted applications, but 3 of these men described the explosion of the Randolph. And initially, I thought it was one of those things where this couldn't have been true. But I started digging into it, and sure enough, there was quite a bit of documentation on it, particularly in the naval documents of the American Revolution. So that was an introduction for me into that massive volume of work, which isn't even completed yet. I think there's something like 13 volumes of it or something like that. But it's really well covered in the journal, and it really, I was doing the book. I finished my book manuscript, and I quickly jumped onto this topic, and there was just a wealth of information about it, and that was really the trigger to start writing about it. Some pretty incredible stories, I think, actually, as part of the battle. And again, the battle doesn't have a name. It's just been referred to as the battle or the action off Barbados. So like many of these naval battles, there aren't names for them because they're not happening near any set geographic point. So this battle happened well off the east coast of Barbados. So again, no geographic point other than the closest island, Barbados.
Yeah, Doug, we always, think about battlefields, naming them after rivers or
Right.
mountain passes, but
Yeah.
it gets a little more tricky when you're at sea. In my book, Doug, if you're the only one to write about it, you get to name it, but that's a different story. Um, let's talk about some of the major players here. I will admit I knew very little about this battle. I've studied the Caribbean extensively, but
Mhm.
I did recognize the name Nicholas Biddle, and I think a
Right.
lot of our readers will recognize that name too. So tell us, who was Nicholas Biddle?
Yeah, Nicholas Biddle was a Philadelphian, as far as I can tell. He was born in 1750. So by the he was a pretty young man as far as naval captains go. So he went to sea, I believe, when he was 15. One of the interesting stories that didn't make it into the article. So the article was pretty heavily edited. I think I submitted it about 5,000 words, something like that. So we cut at least 1,000 or more words out of the article. But one of the details was that Biddle went to sea at 15 with his brother Charles Biddle, who also became a prominent figure. But on his first voyage, he was marooned off the Yucatan Peninsula. So he was marooned for the period of 2 weeks while others went to search for a rescue ship. So he's on his first voyage, he spent 2 weeks marooned on an island. So that was the start of his naval career, which is pretty interesting. That he continued sailing after that. So I believe he served with his brother for a while, Charles, on merchant vessels. I believe I don't believe they were navy vessels at the time. And then I believe somewhere about 1769 or 70, if I recall correctly, he sought a commission in the Royal Navy. So he went to England, according to his biographer, where he was rated a midshipman in the Royal Navy. So that's the an officer in training, as I understand it, paralleling to maybe the midshipman today of the Naval Academy. But so he served in the Royal Navy for a time, and one of the other components, or the other pieces that didn't make it to the article, was that he served in an expedition to the Arctic, which was beginning to be explored at that time. This is also at the same time that James Cook was discovering a lot of the northern Pacific and his journeys there. This is before that, but it was a precursor to a lot of James Cook's expeditions. But on the journey, Biddle, who also served with Horatio Nelson, who was a well-known, obviously a very well-known naval figure, and I believe they were. I'm sure they served on the same ship together. I'm sure they knew each other, and were maybe even friendly. I don't know. Haven't dug into it too much more, but Horatio Nelson was a contemporary of Biddle. So right about the time of the Revolution, when the conflict started to heat up, it was probably right about the time of Lexington and Concord. He resigned his position in the Royal Navy and came back to Philadelphia, where he was on he gained a commission on a gunboat, I believe, near Philadelphia near Philadelphia. I think it was called the Franklin, if I recall correctly. So that was the start of his naval career, and eventually he gained a commission in the Continental Navy at the age of, I believe, right about 25 years old. So a pretty young naval captain.
Yeah, so Doug, in your article, this doesn't set up to be a battle initially.
Right.
Biddle will be given a mission by Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Really, a naval engagement is not part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, history does what it wants to do, though.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about the charge that Congress gave him.
Yeah, so Biddle served on a brigantine, a brig or a brigantine. I've learned these naval terms doing this article, but there was a brig called the Andrew Doria, and it was I believe that was a famous Italian naval figure, and the ship was named after it. But a brig was a two-masted ship, a pretty small ship. He served on that ship for a time, and then while he was serving on that ship, Congress built the Continental Congress commissioned new frigates for the American Navy, and these frigates were larger ships. These are three-masted ships, significantly larger than these two-masted brig ships, which were converted into naval vessels or naval ships. So the Randolph, he was almost immediately, I believe he was one of the first named captains for the Randolph, which was built in Philadelphia by famed naval architects. Joshua Humphreys, I believe, was his name. I may have gotten that wrong, but he was the same figure who built the Navy's six frigates, as I understand it. So the famous U.S. Navy six super frigates that were built in the 1790s, I believe. There's a great book by Ian Toll, I believe, that details that, and Humphreys is a part of that, if I remember. But he was the same figure who had built those. So there's some heritage and some provenance to the Randolph as it was built, but it's built in Philadelphia. And one of the interesting parts of the Randolph and Biddle, I think they were tied together pretty closely, but there was a push by Congress to get Biddle and the Randolph out of Philadelphia. So this is early 1777, and reader or the listeners or the readers, viewers of this podcast may realize that the British Army was getting pretty close to Philadelphia by early 1777. So this is not long after Princeton and Trenton, or Trenton and Princeton rather. So the British Army was moving, or was very apparent, had a goal on Philadelphia. So Congress's direction was to Biddle was to get your ship manned with sailors, and then get provisions underway and get out of Philadelphia before the British arrived, either from the north over the ground, or more likely around up through the around New Jersey and up through potentially the Chesapeake Bay or another route up the Schuylkill River. So, so the Congress's original direction was to move to Martinique to intercept British shipping, and that was their initial direction. Things went. Biddle did get out of Philadelphia pretty quickly. I believe in February 1770 he left Philadelphia long before the British arrived, of course. But immediately trouble sprung up. They broke a mast off the coast of, I believe it was maybe Delaware. They had almost immediately their mast broke, and they limped into Charleston, South Carolina, which was a pretty fateful thing to have happened to them. So they couldn't go north; they had to go south to a safe port. So they pretty quickly, with a broken mast, got to Charleston.
Doug, if you could, this may not be easy, but to set up both sides, talk about the British presence in this area. What were they doing? What were their objectives? What did their presence look like?
I think I would say that for most of the war, as far as I could gather, that Charleston was pretty clear of British shipping. There was an invasion in June of 1776, of course. The famous image you should see of from Sullivan's Island, I guess it was Fort Moultrie, I believe, of the attack there and the repulse of that attack. But soon after that, the British, the port of Charleston seemed to flourish to me. I think it was some of the other components of the article that weren't included, where that Charleston really traded heavily with Caribbean ports, with French ports. It became there were many privateers that were privateering commissions, letters of marque that were issued in Charleston. Charleston started a state navy. They had one of the largest state navies of the 13 colonies, the largest in the South. Many ships, primarily smaller ships, but they started a state navy to keep that port open. So I don't know if you want to say if it was because of the privateers and the state navy that the coast remained clear, but British ships didn't really start to patrol that area until I guess it was late 1777 when Charleston was blockaded, which actually started this, which actually triggered this battle.
Okay, Doug. So we've come to the moment. Take us through this unnamed battle off the coast of Barbados.
Yeah, so the Randolph put into port in 1777. They had their masts. They had their mast replaced. Actually, the mast was struck by lightning while it was in port, so it was replaced. They had a third mast installed on the ship with a lightning rod, which I found pretty interesting. That also didn't make it into the article, but it was one of the, I understand, the fewer ships, or one of the newer ships of the time, to have this newfound technology placed at the top of its mast, the lightning rod. So, but yeah, the Randolph spent 1707 in Charleston. They actually went on an expedition, a very successful expedition that captured a British brig in September of 1777. And then late in 1777, a few British ships showed up off the coast. There were three smaller British ships which showed up off the coast. But that was all that was needed to really bottle up Charleston, to block access to the port. So anyone that knows Charleston geography of the time was that there was a geographic element known as the Charleston Bar. So it's famous of the time at the time, but it was the Charleston Harbor at the time had a very narrow channel through which ships could pass, or through which ships of any with any deep draft could pass. So it was pretty easy for the British to bottle up Charleston, and they did so for several months, during which there was actually a pretty large fire in Charleston, which was seemed to have been blamed on loyalists or even sailors from these ships coming ashore and possibly setting a fire. I don't know if there's any proof of that. It's possible, maybe not. But yeah, Charleston got bottled up for several months, and it became really a political necessity and an economic necessity to clear the bar, so to speak. So that's where this expedition came from. Was the Randolph was certainly the biggest warship in port at the time. There was another ship in port at the time called the Notre Dame, which was a South Carolina ship. And then there were actually four other ships that were brought into the state navy. They were privateer ships or private merchant vessels. They were converted into warships for the South Carolina State Navy. So there were eventually five of them. Five ships were engineered to go on this expedition to clear the bar and then go on a cruise to the Caribbean. So in February of 1777, the squadron was in place, led by the Captain Biddle and the Randolph, and four South Carolina ships. Three of them were former privateers that were given commissions in the State Navy for 6 months. So, and they were all manned by privateer captains, essentially. So the four South Carolina ships were many of the sailors had been privateers and or part of the State Navy. So the expedition that left Charleston in February of 1778 found no ships off the Charleston Bar. Their ships had left. They had put into East Florida, and I believe one of the ships went in pursuit of an inbound ship, but there were no ships off the Charleston Bar when they left. So they proceeded on their cruise to the Caribbean and got all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados. If you know the geography of the Caribbean, Barbados and Trinidad and Tobago are not far off the northeast coast of South America. So that's where the Randolph and the three other ships and one ship that they captured came across a very large British ship in March of 1778.
Doug, if you could talk about maybe the aftermath of this battle. What does it change? What are the circumstances? That moving forward, it's very difficult to pin down a single event like this when you consider how large and extensive Britain's presence on the high seas were.
Yeah.
But from your research, how would you say it changed the dynamic of the region?
Yeah, I think that it certainly changed. I would think the nature of the naval, the battle and the explosion of the Randolph and the loss of all the men. So the Randolph and the four other ships right off the coast of Barbados encountered the Yarmouth, a third-rate ship of the line, and the battle was only 15 minutes long. And the article goes into quite a bit of detail on this, but after a short battle primarily between the Yarmouth and the Randolph. The Randolph blew up, in spectacular fashion, and about 301 men died almost instantly, which was a quite spectacular event. I don't know that there's been maybe an event. There was an event in the Revolution that was quite like that. There was an explosion, of course. There were other ship explosions, as I understand it, but with smaller ships. But 301 men died almost instantly. Four survived. And that in the article, I went into a lot of research on the four men that survived. Did a lot of research in the English in the UK archives, tracking some of them down and how they in their service in the British Navy or the Royal Navy. But as far as the impact of the battle, the South Carolina Navy and the Continental Navy didn't much work together anymore. So the squadron which left Charleston was the largest to leave there during the war, and I don't know that there was much cooperation beyond that in terms of larger squadrons or even a smaller squadron of a few ships. So I think it had a big impact on how operations were conducted in southern waters. And, I think it was a huge toll on the Continental Navy. Their new frigate, one of their new frigates that was a purpose-built frigate, which was quite rare, blew up, and it's one of its most experienced captains and crews also perished. So I think that was extremely unfortunate for the Continental Navy, which was up against huge odds. And then I think it also ended what I would consider South Carolina State Navy squadrons in the Caribbean. So the tradition had been before this and afterward of not many squadrons in Caribbean waters or too far from the shore. So most of the State Navy ships had been one or two ships cruising the Caribbean waters, and that really started back up after this battle. There weren't really concerted efforts to group ships together and take large amounts of British ships. So it changed quite a bit.
So, Doug, we always end this show the same way. We ask the same question.
Yeah.
It gets to the heart, really, of what we do here.
Mhm.
How do you think your article helps us understand the Revolutionary Era better?
Yeah, so one thing I think you mentioned this earlier was that the scope of the war in the West, in what were called the West Indies or the Caribbean, that soon after this event, France joined the war as well as Spain, and the Dutch were involved too, as I understand it. I haven't researched that much, but the Caribbean became a pretty large battleground from what I can understand from the records of the area. So the naval documents of the American Revolution are full of just incidents of ships being taken all over the Caribbean. So I think that's one of the things that was a big realization for me was the scope of the naval war in the Caribbean, and this interplay of this very interesting geographic map of British islands and French islands and Spanish-controlled islands all existing in the same place, and the navies crisscrossing each other, battling each other, taking its ships was really an eye-opening discovery for me, and something I really enjoyed getting into. There's probably lots more stories there to write about. And I would say that the last thing was the scope of the South Carolina Navy. I wrote a lot about the South Carolina Navy, and it wasn't included in the article. Maybe it's the topic of a future article, I would think. But the South Carolina Navy was pretty extensive. I think they did a pretty good job of keeping South Carolina's coast clear, whether it be privateers or the state Navy ships. I think they did a pretty laudable job with pretty minimal resources, keeping the port open and also intercepting British ships off the coast and even in the Caribbean even. So you think maybe of the state navies clinging to their coast, but the South Carolina Navy ventured out pretty far. They took ships in the Caribbean, and some of them actually came back to Charleston as prizes. So that was interesting to read about and learn about too.
Wonderful. Well, Doug, thank you so much for joining us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, Doug.